Okay, so now I have to explain how a digital camera works. You're like, why? Why do you have to explain to me how a digital camera works? Well, there's really two reasons. I want you to remember this. Digital images come from somewhere. There's only two places a digital image can come from. It could be scanned in, we'll talk about scanning in the next video, or it can be taken with a digital device of some sort, usually a camera. And so, whether it's a digital camera or whether it's a scanner, those are the ways that images come from the outside world in. Otherwise, the image is born digital. It's computer generated. It's a whole different beast right now. So, if we're going to correct things and if we're going to understand what's wrong with things or if we're going to manipulate things, we probably should understand a little bit more how the thing got here in the first place. And digital cameras are a wild and wacky bunch. So let's start off by thinking about how digital cameras are different than analog cameras. So, show you my amazing drawing skills, right? Here we go. Da 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 da. Voila, we have a camera. Now, back in the days when cameras were analog, we used to put in them this magical thing called film. Yay! Right here's the container of film. And there it is. And voila. There it is. Film. It goes inside the camera. So let's start off with this. What has replaced film inside of a digital camera? Interestingly enough, the most common answer I get is actually inaccurate. Most people do this. They go, well, of course, the flash drive or the compact flash drive, whatever the memory card is, the memory card. But if you actually look at a roll of film represents two things inside of a camera. Yes, it is in fact the storage card. So when I put a roll of film in the camera, that's, 24 images or 36 images. But interestingly enough, it also represents something that is often overlooked, and that it's the image sensor itself. That is the thing that's capturing it. And so really, a roll of film represents both the sensor and the storage in a digital camera. Why this is so important is that what you don't realize right away is that with a film camera, you replaced the sensor every roll of film. With a digital camera, you never replace the sensor, and that sensor, from the moment you buy it, is starting to get old and degrade and fall apart. And that's one of the reasons why it's kind of strange as someone who's an old film photographer. My film camera might have lasted, 20, 30, 40 years. It lasts until it dies. And those good optics, those glass lenses, that was a real investment. Now it's the other way around. The lenses are still a good investment, but the camera body itself is eventually going to die. That's an interesting way of looking at it. And I like to have that conversation because, again, we don't even think about it. Yes, this is a big fancy camera. Like, what about the one on my phone? Well, your phone, your phone is this tiny little thing, and technically from the side there's a little lens and the sensors inside of it. And again, when we start talking about the good camera or a bad camera or whatever, we really are talking about how big is the sensor and how big are the optics. Because the bigger the optics, usually the better the optics, and again, the bigger the sensor, you usually get more resolution, more megapixels. All right, so we've got that thing going for us to understand that there's a basic difference and that digital cameras do not last forever, which is, again, something that we definitely want to be thinking about. So we're often used to thinking about cameras in how quickly we run them. We point, we shoot, click, done. People who shoot with manual cameras, they realize there's a lot of other things they have to work on. For instance, they're going to worry about, let's try this one. They're going to worry about the shutter speed, right? The shutter speed is going to be one. The shutter speed is how fast the shutter opens and closes. And they're also going to be worried about the aperture, which is basically the size of the hole that you're looking through, the hole the light passes through. So in a real camera, the shutter is physical and the aperture is physical and it opens and closes. And so these are things that you can adjust. And so when you start getting into digital cameras, even though the megapixels might be great, the number of apertures or the speed of the sensor are all things that are going to make a big difference. Now, most of the cameras are going to be on auto, so you don't think about any of it. You think, auto speed, auto aperture, which means, of course, there is a light sensor in there that's making sure that the light is very good. And whether you're dealing with a film camera or a digital camera, there are some basic settings: speed, aperture, focus. And I'm not here to teach you how to be a good photographer, but I do want you to realize that all these things come to make a difference. There are really two other main components when you're looking at a film versus a digital camera. In a film camera, we also look at something called the ISO, or the speed of the film. So if you were to get a low ISO film, let's say an ISO film of 100, that would be what we really consider a daylight film. It requires a lot of light and it looks good. But indoors, you wouldn't be able to get enough light on the film to get a good picture. So if you wanted an indoor film, you'd use 400 ISO. And of course, the higher the ISO, the less light you need, but the more noise you get, the deeper the grain is. Also, if you're really looking for fast action, you'd use a high ISO film. Digital cameras have an ISO as well, and if you set your digital camera to a low ISO, it uses a certain amount of light. If you use it to a high ISO, you need less light and you can stop fast action. But with ISO, instead of getting grain, which is what we get in our film world, in the digital world we get noise, and the artifact of noise can be a big problem. Now, what's also cool is in the world of film, you pop a roll of film in there, there's nothing you can do for 24 exposures or 36 exposures. But in a digital camera, where ISO, and a good digital camera does let you change the ISO, that means I can change it on the fly. So all of a sudden, if I don't think of a camera as an automatic device anymore, all of a sudden I can change the speed, the aperture, the focus, and the ISO. A lot of things to mess with, and of course, good photographers know how to mess with all of those things. Again, there's a one-to-one correlation between film and digital. Now, this last part is new. So, one of the things that we run into, and we run into this a lot, is, and I always ask people look up, and I look up and I go, what color is the light? And generally, wherever you are, unless it's me asking the question, you'd say, white? The light's white. But is it really? Because we actually run into the issues of what temperature the light is. This idea about light temperature is one that comes in frequently, and you probably noticed this, that incandescent lights tend to be a little yellower, and modern LEDs tend to be a little bluer, and we're always talking about what temperature the light is. So the thing about it is that different lights emanate different frequencies. And so, for instance, we have noonday light, noon sunlight, north skylight. All of these things tell you which frequencies the light's giving out. And of course, the good old-fashioned daylight is going to give you what's called the full spectrum of light. And that's what we're really looking for. When we're buying these cheap lights, they only give out a couple of frequencies, and so they tend to be in the yellows or the blues. You can pay good money for better lights, but there it is. Now, when you're shooting with the camera, and I always joke, if you notice, you never have to color correct photos that are outdoors. Turns out that your digital camera is guessing what color the lighting is, and it's really good at guessing daylight. Now, when we talk about light, we talk about the temperature of the light. We don't mean the actual temperature. We talk about temperature in terms of degrees Kelvin, and what that means is whether the light is sort of yellow to blue, and this is sort of a way of looking at how we measure sort of the temperature or the color of the light. And we measure the color, the temperature, light in degrees Kelvin. That's just the way it works. Why is this important? Well, when you're using your digital camera, your camera is probably set to something called AWB, or auto white balance. It's probably guessing what color the light is. And as I mentioned earlier, it's really good at guessing daylight. Outdoors, you're fine. But just like with all the other settings that you can change in your camera, if you really start getting good at your camera, you can actually start to go through the settings of the camera. And you're going to see, usually they're little pictures. There's going to be like one that tells you it's sunlight. So this would be a manual white balance setting. Or there's going to be one that's cloudy. Or there's going to be one that's going to be incandescent light bulb. Mine looks like a mushroom. Or it's going to be one that's going to tell you it's fluorescent. You might even have one that tells you it's the camera flash. Camera flash is always a difficult one because it's always going to be tuned differently. And then lastly, you're going to see one that might look like this, and it's going to be a little bit different, and that's going to be called One Touch, which is a form of manual white balance. And the idea is that if you are in a controlled environment, by controlled environment I mean not daylight where the lighting keeps changing, but if you're a controlled environment, what I could do is I could take a gray card or a white piece of paper, and I could point my camera at it, and I can say this thing right here, photograph this, and I'm going to say this is white. The camera's going to go, you call that white? And then it's going to go, oh, and it's going to subtract the color, and it's going to create a manual white balance. Now, if you work in a studio, this is exactly what we do. In a studio, we work with a known quantity. We'll have color bars, and we'll set up the lights, and we'll photograph with a color bar included, and then we're able to adjust the color either ahead of time in the camera by telling it that's what gray is, or in post because we have a known quantity somewhere in our photograph. So this idea of how do we fix the color of an image is done one of two ways. Again, we either know ahead of time by having the camera set to our environment, or we have a known quantity in it, and then we have Photoshop in post fix it to a known quantity. Either way, we're dealing with a known quantity. You fix it ahead of time, or you fix it afterwards. Now, a lot of people don't like that. And the reason they don't like that is because they make the mistake of forgetting that all the camera can do is show you what's there, not what you want to see. I have a friend who wasn't feeling well, was not feeling well for a while, and we went to photograph him. He looked pale as a ghost. Terrible. We set the camera right. The camera photographed him exactly pale as a ghost. He wanted us to make him a little rosier in the cheeks. Well, that's not what he looks like. And that changes the rules a little bit. So camera doesn't make you look the way you want to look. It makes you look the way you look. At the end of the day, no amount of angles are going to change the fact that I don't have a lot of hair anymore. There you go. Except Photoshop. Maybe we can add some later. But that's different, and that's not what we're doing in this tutorial. All right. So anytime you're going to see things that were done from a professional, they're going to have done all this ahead of time. But it's important when you look at an image and you see something that you're unhappy with, and you're like, why are those colors off? And it all goes back to the fact the camera couldn't guess what the color was. Now, one last little bit of information on the camera, and that is, how is this all working? Well, let's think about this in a different way. The camera sensor, I always do that. The camera sensor is collecting data. By the way, what's weird about camera sensors collecting data is that the camera sensors collect data pretty much in the same way that the human eye does. Matter of fact, when the original digital camera was invented, they actually used what's called a Bayer map. And if you look at it, what you're going to notice is that the actual distribution of sensors is that there's actually twice the amount of green sensors than red and blue. And the reason why is because if you look at, remember how the eye works, right? Even though we have those red, green, and blue sensors, if you look right in the middle, we have the rods, remember? The monochromatic. And the monochromatic is really going to be picking up mostly green. We are green sensing beings. Remember that? I'm going to show it to you again, right? How much green? Look, all that green. We see green better than anything else. And so the guy who invented the digital camera was like, we need to see more green. So we actually made it so that you could see more green, and that's actually happening all in there. So you've got this idea of this sensor, and the sensor is creating all this raw data. Interestingly enough, the sensor is creating more data than we're actually going to save. Remember the 8 bits per channel, that's 16 million colors? Well, your digital camera probably can capture more than that. It probably can capture 10 or 12 bits per channel. It doesn't give it to you. Instead, what's going to happen is that the data is going to come off the camera, and it's going to have this thing. And it's basically, this is the raw data. This is just all the data off of the sensor. Now, it doesn't know what to keep of that, right? Because it's trying to turn that 10 or 12 bits of RGB into 8 bits of RGB. So how does it do that? Well, it's actually going to go through and it's going to look at what the white balance setting is. The white balance setting is going to actually tell it how to look at that data, because the white balance is going to change what the sensor is doing. And it's going to take the data from the data from the camera and the white balance, and it's going to go, wait a second, I need to throw away some of this data too. Why? Because it's probably going to save a JPEG file. So we're going to have the JPEG compression settings, right? So there's going to be the JPEG setting, and then then it puts it all together. It's going to throw away data along the way, and it's going to give you a very good JPG file. Ta-da! There's your JPEG file. You know, that means it's throwing away data. What that also means is that if you've got your white balance setting wrong, that you've actually thrown away data that you may have meant to keep along the way. And again, most digital cameras, this is just how it works. Don't feel bad. This is how, and for the most part, it works fine. But those crazy professionals out there, they want all the raw data. So they take all the raw data as is, and instead of using that data and being changed by the JPEG settings and being changed by the white balance settings, they actually take the white balance setting as its own bit of data, white balance, and they package it using lossless compression, and they call it camera raw. And this raw file is basically all the data that you got from the camera waiting to be opened and changed. Technically, a camera raw file isn't a digital image yet. It's the sensor data and the camera settings waiting for you to make a determination of what to do with them. Camera raw opens in an Adobe product called, surprisingly enough, Camera Raw. And when you do that, it actually is going to say, how do you want me to handle the data? How do you want me to set the white balance? What do you want me to do? So you can actually do all these little fidgets beforehand, and then when you open it in Photoshop, it bakes the two together. Just like before when we had the vector-based graphic, that EPS, that logo, and it asked you how many pixels you wanted, and then it opened it as a bitmap file. Same thing here. It's going to make you make all these decisions, and then it's going to open it as a bitmap file. And then you can save that as a PNG or a TIFF or a JPEG. So all of these things, that's great, but it's also difficult, because what you find is that camera raws can be manipulated in so many ways. And because they can be manipulated in so many ways, you find that images that you thought were garbage, there's still a lot of good data there that drives people crazy when there's a lot of good data left over. All right. So that being said, let's review. Your digital camera works just like a film camera, except the sensor represents the film and the memory card represents the film. Just like a good camera, you'll have things like focus and aperture, shutter speed. ISO is, in this case, isn't grain, but digital noise. But white balance is a very big factor in computing how that sensor data is handled, because the sensor is bad at guessing what color the light is. Humans are great at guessing what color the light is. That's a technique built into us called color constancy, where regardless, if I walk into a red room, I'll go, look at that blue shirt in a red room, because if everything else is red, I instantly subtract it out. I'm good at that. Don't get too excited. It turns out goldfish can do it too. So the idea is that's what happens with these things. And again, white balance being so important means that we can either calibrate our cameras to a known value, a known lighting value before we start, or if we have a known value in the image, which is always good, we can color correct it afterwards. It also lets us know that's what we're looking for. We're looking for this idea of how the lighting represents truth. The next step beyond that step would be, how do we make it so that the image looks like I want it to look, not necessarily what a true representation of the environment looks like. And then lastly, some people who have the time and effort decide to save all the sensor data, all the settings of their camera in a file format called Camera Raw, which then gets sort of developed later and gives you more data to work with. Again, it just gives you also more grief to work with at the same time. So this is how digital cameras work. But wait, there's more. So let's delete some of these pages. I like that picture. I was like, the more you know, because that's what happens with these things. So, oh, it's so pretty. Not really, I'm a terrible illustrator. All right. So there you go. That's your Camera Raw. And remember, even without Camera Raw, there are compression settings inside of your digital camera, and no one tells you what they are. Your camera is going to say high, medium, low. Never gives you the actual percentage numbers, because it changes from model to model. You'd have to look them up, and it's very hard to find out. All right. One last little exercise before we're ready for Photoshop. So images can be taken with a photograph, or they can be scanned. And to do that, I want to talk about two different worlds. On one side, we have the real world. And on the other side, we have the virtual world. What is a unit of measurement inside of the real world? You're thinking to yourself, Go ahead, scream at the computer. Do it. Do it. No, don't do it. Just, no. Apparently, the computer wants to scream back at me. Ding is right. So let's say inches. In the real world, we measure things in inches. Well, what do we measure things in the virtual world? I already told you. First thing, pixels. We measure things in pixels. Now, here's the fun part. What piece of technology do we have that turns pixels into inches? It's not a trick question. What piece of technology turns pixels into inches? And the answer is a printer. Printer turns pixels into inches. And what is the opposite of a printer? What turns inches into pixels? And the answer is the opposite of a printer is a scanner, which is why they come bundled. Now, printers and scanners both use a very important term called DPI. And I want to take a moment and truly explain to you what DPI is so you know when it is, where it is, and when it just doesn't matter. Because unless, and I want you to listen to me carefully, unless you're printing or scanning, DPI is irrelevant. You're like, then why are you telling me? Because I need to let you know. I don't know what you're doing. All right. So let's talk about DPI. DPI, come over here. There we go. DPI stands for dots per inch. Now, normally, if I have somebody in the room, I would go, I want someone to ask me the same stupid question 3 times. Of course, I'm going to volunteer you in the back right there. You, yes, you. Ready for the question? All right, here's the question. Wait. I can do this. I'm a 2-man show now, right? All right. All right. How far away is Toledo? How far away is Toledo, you ask? Well, 120 miles. Thanks. How far away is Toledo? How far away is Toledo? About 2 hours. Sounds pretty good. Thanks. Let's do it one more time. How far away is Toledo? 35 miles an hour. That doesn't make any sense. Neither did the other one. Think about it. Sorry about that. When I told you, or him, or me, when I told you that Toledo was 120 miles away, makes perfect sense. When I told you it was about 2 hours away, you made assumptions. What did you assume? You assumed that I was driving on the highway 60 miles an hour. Anytime somebody tells you something is an hour away, you think 60 miles an hour. You just multiply in your head. Right now, I'm about an hour away from the office. If I were to walk, because I'm slow. I'm not that far away from the office, though. The idea is I left out some of the information, and you made an assumption. Well, most importantly, the last one, how far away is Toledo? 35 miles an hour? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense because 35 miles an hour is not a piece of information that is a fact. It is a ratio, or in this case, it's a rate, right? I can say, if I say 35 miles an hour, then I would say how many hours? I would say how much distance, but it's not enough. And DPI, dots per inch, is a rate. It's a ratio. It's not an actual number. So DPI can lead us to resolution. We can glean it from it, but it isn't resolution itself. Let me give you an example on why it matters and how we're going to do this. So the first thing is, when it comes to DPI, it's a question of, let's say, scanning. Let's start with printing. So let's say for a moment that I have 1,000 pixels. How big can I print 1,000 pixels? And the answer is, how big do you want to print it? See, you left out part of the equation. You left off part of the sentence. And it's these types of things that I have to pick on you for, even though you're not here. When you say, how big can I print this? What you really mean, how big can I print it and it still look good? Aha. Now we've got a judgment in there. Well, what does still look good mean? Well, what we're talking about is how close do the pixels have to be together when printed, so how close do the dots have to be together when printed for visual acuity to take over, or in this case be lost, and not for me to actually see it look good. It's a weird one when we talk about visual acuity and imagery. Remember, when I tell people about visual acuity, if you're looking at a computer screen, you want to find exactly where your visual acuity is and sit closer because I want to be able to resolve every dot on the screen. But when I'm watching television, I want to find exactly where my visual acuity can see everything and then go back an inch so everything blends together. There's little differences in there and what kind of we're looking for in terms of fidelity. And what we're looking here for is this idea of looking for what's known as continuous tone, where the dots disappear one step beyond. So, in that case, we are looking at trying to figure out what our acuity is going to be measured by. I've got lots of equations for this, but it's going to make your life really easy to know that the human eye, all things being equal, will blur everything out at 200 dots per inch. Now, all things being equal means photographically. What do I mean by photographically? How big is a photograph? And before you think that this is some sort of a trick question, it isn't. How big is a photograph? 4 by 6, 5 by 7, 8 by 10, 11 by 14, 11 by 17, 24 by... Wait a second. At what point is it no longer a photograph? At what point is it a poster? At what point is it a billboard? And there's a really interesting answer. I've been doing this for a long time. And what ends up happening is that a photograph is something that's held at arm's length. So it's got to be big enough to be held at arm's length. It's got to be big enough to be held so far away from you. And if it gets to be so much bigger, it's a poster. And when it's so much bigger, you step back. And when you step back, that DPI number gets lower and lower. At the office, I did the elevator doors. The elevator doors are these huge murals, but you don't look up at them and look at them. You stand back from them. And a billboard, you stand even further back. If you were as close to a billboard as you were to a photograph, the dots would be enormous. Of course, you're not meant to see it that way. So a billboard might be at 10 dots per inch. But again, because you're so far back, it doesn't matter. But for our photographic world, which basically means anything at arm's length, we're basically looking at 200 dots per inch is the minimum, 300 is better, and again, the bigger it gets, the further back you can go away. Now, why this is so important is you'll remember that I mentioned that a 1 megapixel camera was 1280 by 960. Now, with 1280 by 960, if I divide that by 200, I get 6.4 by 4.8. And there you go. There's your 4 by 6 inch photograph, maybe a little bit better, maybe almost 5 by 7. And so at the end of the day, if somebody were to hand you a digital image and everything else was good, the color was good, and the compression was good, because nothing I knew about compression artifacts. But if somebody hands me a photograph that's 800 by 600 and says, how big can I print it? Well, I'll divide that by 200. That's 4 by 3, and that sucks. But if they hand me a photograph that's 4,000 by 3,000, and I want to know how big I can print that, well, then all of a sudden I'm looking at, oh my goodness, 20 by 15, and I probably can push that even further, because 20 by 15 is already a poster, I'm already going to be standing back, so I probably can even print it bigger than that if I wanted to. So, if we're printing, we're looking for this acuity thing, and again, the magic number is 200 DPI, also making sure the compression is good. So all you got to do is divide it by 200, and there you are. What's nice about this is that we have all this data. Remember, we have all these beautiful images of the Cleveland Museum of Art's collection. And those are either photographed or scanned at huge resolution. Actually, bigger resolution than you probably could even imagine. Let me see what I have here. Let's take a look. I'm going to go into another window, as it were. See what I have in front of me. Right, so I'm going to take a look at, let's find a nice one. So this one right here, I'm going to bring up a new window for it. Let's take a look at this little blue frog here. Attached file, insert printout. Attached file. Apparently not. See, this is an uncompressed TIFF. Insert printout. Did it work? There we go. So let's take a look at this. Now, what am I looking at from a true perspective? If I look at the properties of this file, this enormous TIFF, what I'm going to find is that it is 1,800 pixels by 4. So it's not that huge. Let's take a look again. So this one is 1805 by 1444. So divide that by 200, that would be divided by 2 would be 900. So 1805 divided by 200 equals, I love this part. Look at that. 1444 divided by 200 equals, look at that. So I can print a nice 7 by 9 out of this, which is fine considering the thing's only this big in the first place. All right, that's what they gave me. Let me try another one of these. But this time I'm going to try a painting. All right, let's see if the painting comes in. Insert printout. So if I wanted to use this painting, which is really big, right, there's the painting. Now I'm going to take a look at how much resolution this one comes with. And what I'm going to find out is this one is a lot bigger. It is 3711 divided by 200 equals 4664 divided by 200 equals, right? So 18 by 23 inches, which is enormous. So think about that. I could take this image and I can print, this enormous thing. Again, difference between photography of a small item and a photography of a painting. But there you go. So we have an enormous amount of data that's available to us. Sometimes we have the other way around. We don't have enough data available to us at all. So DPI is very good when we're translating from the digital world to the real world and this world of print. But for the rest of us, we have to ask ourselves a really stupid question. 3711 by 4664, right? That's the resolution of this picture. The resolution of my screen is 1920 by 1080. It's bigger than it. There you go. It's done. It's bigger than my screen. In other words, I don't need DPI. If I'm going from pixels to pixels, I'm good to go. And that's really what you need to know. If you're dealing with the screen, you know the resolution of your screen. And of course, you may have a higher resolution screen, but for the most part, you're golden. Same thing goes with the web. If you're putting something on the web, you're not designing for print. And you'll hear back in the olden days, they'd go, the print is 300 DPI and the web is 72. But it doesn't make any... The screen was never 72 dots per inch. That was a misnomer where they would put that down. We don't know what the screen sizes were. Somehow that became inherited. You're going to see that in technologies. Never say that the screen size is 72 DPI. Screens have different densities, screens have different sizes, and it doesn't make sense. Pixels are pixels. We are worried about how big our screen is. The only time printing matters is when we're trying to get printing density, and then the DPI is a way of translating that. But wait, there's the other way around. And the other way around is, how do I turn images into pixels? And that's where we get into scanning. So for instance, for a moment, let's say that I have a picture. And that picture, let me make sure you understand that it's a picture, right? There it is. It's a picture. So I have this picture and I want to scan it in. When you scan, what you're asking the scanner to do is, how closely are you going to look at the image? If you scan the image at 100 DPI, that means that every inch of the image you're going to extract 100 dots. If you scan at 1000 DPI, that means every inch of the picture you're going to scan at 1000 dots. Now, there is a mathematical and optical and digital limit to your scanner. Your scanner may let you scan at 1,000,000 DPI, but it's lying to you. If you look at the details on the scanner, somewhere on the box, it's going to tell you the maximum optical resolution. That's all that matters. Everything else is just making up data. So if your scanner can scan at 2,000 dots per inch and it offers you 3,000 and 2,000 is the limit, that's all that matters, and you do 2,000. The webcam I'm using right now is a 2 megapixel webcam. Somewhere in the documentation it says that it can extrapolate to 15. That means it can make it up. I don't need my webcam to make up data. We're learning Photoshop. We've got Photoshop for that. So this is what I'm looking at, is how closely can I look at something? And you're thinking, all right, well then, since I want as much data as possible, shouldn't I just always scan at the maximum allowed? And that would work, but it doesn't. And it doesn't, oops, turn that off. And it doesn't because of another little problem we run into, and that is, what is the source of your image? What do I mean by what is the source of your image? So what are you scanning? And what you're scanning becomes a really important thing. A lot of times you're scanning something which we would refer to in the business as original. My shirt. If you were to scan my shirt at the maximum optical resolution, you would see the woven fabric of my shirt, because that's what it does, like a microscope. That's an original item. But most people don't come to me with original items. They come to me with things that have previously been printed. They have come to me with things from books or magazines or prints that are post the late 1800s. Before the 1800s, they didn't actually print, they engraved, and it's a different type of process. So for instance, if I were to come over here and bring up Blue Hawaii, the greatest Elvis film ever, and if you didn't know that, by the way, it is the greatest Elvis film ever. So here it is. There's Blue Hawaii. By the way, Angela Lansbury plays Elvis's mother. That's a great bit of trivia there. If I were to come over here and to start zooming in, what you're going to notice is, other than that Angela Lansbury is somehow with the ukulele, is that if I keep zooming in, you're going to notice that where it's purple and where it's yellow, it's actually made up of dots. And that's because that is how this technology works. Is that when you go to print, the printers don't actually lay the color on top of each other. Some printers do, really good dye sublimation printers do, but that's not generally how things work at all. See, the idea is that a newspaper can't print grayscale, and this printer here can't print the color orange. Instead, what it does is it translates the color into multiple colors, into what's called a halftone pattern, and those colors are laid next to each other, and due to this wonderful thing called visual acuity, your eye blends it together. So if I were to look over here, what you would notice is that you're actually seeing a dot pattern, and that dot pattern is there. The thing is if you keep scanning, eventually those dots just become bigger. There is a physical limitation to how much you can scan off of images that have already been printed because of the mechanical dot process that is made up of printed images. Now, we go back to that painting we looked at a little while ago. You can, because that painting was done with paint and canvas, you can zoom in as far as you can. Eventually, you will see the woven fabric of the canvas and the paint texture. That's wonderful. But if it's a book, or a magazine, or anything that's been mechanically printed in the past 100 years, it was created with these things called halftones, and they've already going to have dots. By the way, that includes your inkjet printer and your laser printer. Your laser printer is made up of very, very, very tiny dots, but the dots are in fact there. And eventually you will be just scanning the dots. So it doesn't matter how big or how small your original is, because at some point you hit the wall of the acuity of your scanner. And the reality of it is, if the item is pre-printed, if you scan at 800 dpi, you will resolve every single dot that it was printed from. And that is literally the end of the printing. Now let me see if I have another example here. I'm going to have to delete this page. Goodbye, Elvis. Elvis has left the presentation. All right. I'm a little silly tonight. All right. Well, I think I'm funny. I hope you do. Let's come back over here. So here is a scan that I did from Alice in Wonderland. Actually, this is from the Looking Glass. Now, this image from the Looking Glass, sorry about warping it, this was physically printed. This was not mechanically printed. This was not made of dots. This was a engraving, which means that each one of those lines was a real item. I just warped it. Sorry about that. So there's going to be no dots here. So I could have scanned this as far as I could allow for it, because again, it was like a drawing onto a drawing. That's an earlier process. So if it's an etching or it's an engraving, you're golden. But that's usually not what happens. What ends up happening is that you're dealing with things that are like from newspapers or magazines. Let me see if I have another example here. Of course I have another example. I'm filled with examples. So if you're dealing with, let me see which this one is. This one is big file, load slow. All right. So this is also an image that have been printed, but not mechanically. So this is probably a lithograph, which means that we could keep zooming in all we would want until we got down to the texture of the paper, which is awesome. But anything that would be done post this, one more example. I think maybe this one's mechanically printed. Not a term you're used to thinking about. I'm thinking about like literally this mechanical reproduction sort of thing. And so when I zoom in, what is this made of? And can I see the dots that it was made from? And I don't think on this one either. I think this one I'm going to be able to go really, really far. And that's the difference, the wonderful part about working with fine art imagery, because this is how they were made. But if you bring me somebody's original drawing or painting, scan it as far as you like. But if you bring me, not responding. If you bring me an original drawing or painting, I can scan as far as you like. But if you're bringing me something like a newspaper or a magazine, it's always 800 dots per inch. And then, again, it doesn't matter because it's just 800 dots per inch. Let me give you another example. So let's say that this was from a newspaper. If the image is only 1 inch tall, and I scan 800 dots per inch, I'm getting 800 pixels, and that's the end of that. I can't scan it at 3,000 dots per inch to get me extra pixels. It's not going to give me extra pixels. It's literally limited to what I'm starting with because it's a limited starting set. I have frozen. This is exciting. Ooh. Oh, we're back to normal. Yay. Thank you, Queen Alice. Maybe we'll delete you too. All right. So, when we print, if we're going photographic, we think 200 dpi will give us the right size, minimum. When we scan, we know we first learn what the maximum capability of our scanner is. We learn to use our equipment. And if it's a real item, we scan at the max. And if it's already been printed, we scan it no more than 800 dpi because beyond that, we're just going to see halftone dots. And in a different tutorial, if you would like, I will show you how to make the halftone dots disappear. But not this moment. That's not what's needed. What's needed is to understand where our images come from. They are either born digital, where I sit down and I just draw, and in which case I will have set my resolution ahead of time. I would have said this is the size of my grid. Or if I was working in a program like Illustrator, I would just draw and let the vectors handle it for me. I'm going to be dealing with something that is created using a scanner, where it brings it in using the scan process. And at which point I would, again, look at the acuity of my scanner and of my object. Or I'm in the real world with the camera and I take my photographs. And that's what you need to know. In my hand I have a digital image. And I should, at this point, be able to understand where it came from, where it's going, why things are successful in it, why things have failed in it, and what the vocabulary of its construction and storage is. And that, in a very large 2-hour or so nutshell, is everything you need to know about digital imaging. And now that we have this common vocabulary, let's go to Photoshop and start to play.